your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Gaytheist Manifesto. From Answer Media, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, joined once again by my co-host, Ari Stillman. What's up, Ari?
Science.
I mean,
Science is always up.
Science is happening somewhere in the world. You're not wrong. So this week, we are changing up the format a bit. So for the last 2 years, we've been mostly bringing you episodes focused on a single topic. So, we'll pick a person or a few people and we'll interview them at length and in depth about a specific thing that's relevant to them, that's maybe relevant to current events or relevant to something that we think is important to be aware of. And while I think these conversations are super valuable, I think doing only that, we end up missing a lot as well. And that kind of hasn't been sitting right with me lately. With the current political climate being the way it is, having a literal fucking cartoon villain for a president and...
Except not as fun.
Well, right, yeah, definitely less fun.
Not as kooky.
And... oh, that kooky guy! And the civil rights of queer and trans folks being in the sort of precarious position they've been in, and have been in, obviously things are a little worse now, we've decided to change things up a little. So each week, we're going to bring you actual news reports. So we're going to report
We are
on...
journalists.
Yes, that's exactly it. So we're going to be reporting and commenting on current events. And, the personal interviews and stuff, that's not going away. That's just not going to be the focus of each show. And so we'll take these news and current events and we'll sort of analyze what these things mean for LGBTQ folks and non-believers at that intersection. Obviously, that's not going anywhere. And we may even hopefully bring you some news you might not hear other places. And as a side note, most of the stories in today's episode were brought to us by the fabulous folks in the Gaytheist Manifesto newsroom.
Callie, what are you talking about? What's the Gaytheist Manifesto newsroom? This is news.
Oh gosh, Ari, I'm so glad you asked. We actually have a secret Facebook group of awesome people who keep us in the loop on really important stories from around the world. So if that sounds like something you would enjoy, head to facebook.com/the Gaytheist Manifesto, shoot us a message, we'll get you added to the group, and if you bring us a story that gets used, you'll get a shout out on the show, and everybody wants a shout out on the show because the show's cool, and we're the cool kids, right?
That's right.
Yeah? Cool kids. Let's get to the show. Some folks in Texas this week were absolutely shocked to find that, yes, indeed, transgender men do in fact exist. Mack Beggs is a 17-year-old guy, and he won a state wrestling title in the girls division. Important to point out that Mack is a trans guy, and he wants to wrestle with other guys because fucking of course he does. But last year, the organization that oversees high school sports in Texas instituted a rule requiring student athletes to compete as the gender listed on their birth certificate. And part of me finds this really funny. I'm fairly certain this rule was intended to keep trans women from competing with other women, unfair advantages and blah, blah, blah. And then, surprise, fuck bags, trans men are a thing.
Yes, this is wonderful. It totally backfired on them in the most glorious way. So like you mentioned, we hear about this with trans feminine people, like, oh, you can't compete against women because you went through male puberty and you have bigger bones and you're stronger and taller, and it's just not fair for you to compete against cis women. So they didn't realize the implications of what would happen when they tried to apply this to a trans masculine person. So Mack was assigned female at birth, so they're like, okay, you have to wrestle the girls. And he's been on testosterone for a year or two. So naturally, he is a bit stronger than the girls that are in his weight class. So they force him to participate in the girls' championship. And he ends up winning the state girls' championship. And now people are throwing a fit because he was taking testosterone. So he was on steroids and he was on performance enhancing drugs, and it wasn't fair. It's like, he's just doing what you wanted. You were like, you have to compete against the girls. And he's like, okay. And you're like, no, he wasn't supposed to win. That's not fair.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So I actually got to talk to Mack on the phone earlier this week. And he was recently interviewed for a piece on ESPN about this whole experience. And hopefully it will dispel some myths about trans people in sports.
Mythbusters.
It really explains the process in depth, or I did at least, about trans males and trans women and how their process is. It's not like a fast process. Like, you don't gain like 5 to 10 pounds of muscle when you're on like testosterone for a year, or you don't lose so much muscle, vice versa, when you're taking estrogen. Like, you know what I mean? And I think it's really going to be an eye opener for a lot of people.
Mack's story is another case where trans people are sort of thrust into the spotlight without wanting to be. It's sort of like Gavin Grimm, right? Like, the kid's just trying to go to the bathroom, and then all of a sudden he's on The View, and he's talking to Laverne Cox, and everybody knows his name, and he's kind of a celebrity now. And Mack, like, he's just trying to wrestle. Like, wrestling is his life. And so, like, needless to say, he wasn't super prepared for this whole thing when it happened.
I never thought that it would make it outside in my local newspaper, like, ever.
This is the kind of thing that happens to trans people and to marginalized people of various groups. They're just trying to go about their life, and their very existence is controversial. This kid is just a 17-year-old high school kid trying to do the high school athletics thing. He loves wrestling, trying to compete in his sport. And just by the fact of trying to do that, he gets thrust into this gigantic nationwide debate and this media frenzy about the role of trans people in sports. Like you mentioned, Gavin Grimm was just trying to go to the bathroom, and now he's got a case going in front of the Supreme Court. So it's not like these are like professional activists being paid off by George Soros or whoever. These are just regular people trying to go about their day. And as a result of these obstacles that are placed in their path, they have to fight against that. And that ends up becoming, a big deal in the media and across the country and across the world. And hopefully it leads to some positive change in the future once they fight back against that.
Mack told me that he only kind of considered himself an activist before this whole thing. And I feel like most trans people are in that space because you sort of, if you're not in a space where everything goes right, you sort of have to become an activist just to stand up for yourself, just to get, competent healthcare and that kind of stuff. And I honestly, I think Mack is handling it a lot better than I did or would.
I never thought it would reach to this extent, like, ever. I'm definitely honored and proud to carry on this role on a bigger scale. It's something that deep down I've always wanted to do, but not necessarily like for it to happen like this way. But I mean, this way, I get to represent not only the LGBT community, but also the sport I love, USA Wrestling. Just makes me feel very honored.
And I really always worry when trans youth are sort of thrown into the spotlight like this. And it's probably kind of problematic of me to just assume that trans youth are automatically like in a vulnerable spot and like really sensitive. Right, exactly. But like, I've been on the internet, right? Like, I know how awful people can be. And I was like really shocked and surprised and happy to hear him talk about how supportive people have been.
Yeah, I get messages every day just, we're here behind you from so-and-so state or so-and-so city or from so-and-so what, and the support is massive.
I also asked what his teammates thought. They
support me 120% all the time. But they know just as much as I do that it is what it is. And they said that they would just be there for me every single day and every time I go on the mat, and just supportive 110% all the time.
But of course, because again, the internet is a thing, not everyone's been nice and supportive, but Mack's a tough kid.
Definitely a lot of negative stuff. But I just block them, and I just, it's going to happen, so might as well just block them. So it doesn't really matter to me.
And Mack also understands rule number 1 of navigating the internet as a trans person, which is, of course, never read the comments.
Never read the comments. Say it with us.
I try not to. Sometimes I do because I scroll too far down, but I know there's gonna be negative comments, and there's no stopping it because there's gonna be ignorant people out there. So it's let them do them, but it ain't gonna do them any good because I'm just I'm just gonna keep on going.
As an athlete, winning the state title at anything is supposed to be like the crowning achievement of your high school career. But when Mack won, there were audible boos from the crowd, and that just pisses me off. Like, come on, guys, this kid has busted his ass to be really good at his sport. He's in a place he doesn't want to be through no fault of his own, and now you're booing? Like, fucking grow up.
He didn't want to compete against the girls and smash your precious little Melinda's face into the mat. He wanted to be competing against the guys, but no, you had to have it your way. And also, you're adults yelling at a 17-year-old. Please don't do that.
Like, I guess Mack is tougher than I am, because I don't know. Like, I don't know that I'd handle that very well.
I just brushed it off. I didn't really care. What I cared about was that I finally won something that I worked really hard for. And that's what I thought in that moment. I didn't think about the boos. I mean, I heard them, but, they didn't faze me.
God, what an awesome kid. I mean, like, I keep saying kid, and that's probably a bad thing. What an awesome young man. I feel like I'm an old woman. Like, I can't call you a kid, even though you're a kid to me.
Oh, young man, you are so handsome. Would you like to meet my granddaughter?
But while he's handling his 15 minutes of fame with lots of grace and dignity, he really just wants to get back to the sport he loves.
I'm going to be, trying to, get a lot of this publicity out of the way, since I'm off of wrestling until, so amount of time, but after that, I'm definitely going to be getting back to my training because I'm going to be competing in USA Wrestling, Freestyle, and Greco. I'm going to be trying to make it on not the world team. Oh God, I wish I could make the world team. The national team for Team Texas for the guys, because I get to wrestle guys in USA Wrestling. So I'm really looking forward to that.
So basically, wrapping this up, what we've learned from this is that bigots don't tend to think out the consequences of their bigotry very well. Fancy that. All of this could have been avoided if they minded their own damn business. And also, testosterone is not Hulk juice.
Valuable lesson.
Yes. If you've ever seen that picture of the white cat coming down the stairs where it was like a time-lapse photo that got messed up and it looks like the cat's arms are out to the side so it's all big and buff. That is what I look like now because of testosterone. Before a year and a half ago, I was 3'5". I weighed 50 pounds. I couldn't even lift my own arms. And now look at me. I'm like a full-fledged human being.
Next up this week, when is Rachel Dolezal not Rachel Dolezal? I'm sure we all remember she was the white woman who pretended to be black and used that to get a position at the head of the Spokane, Washington chapter of the NAACP. She even had the audacity to sue Howard University for race discrimination. She's back in the news lately because she has decided to adopt a name that originates from the Igbo language, which is spoken in Nigeria, and the name is Kechinyere. I think I'm saying that right. It translates into what God has given, or gift of God. That sound you're hearing off in the distance that sounds like tapping, that's the sound of a few thousand faces hitting desks simultaneously. There are obviously some really serious problems with this in terms of racism, but this particular case actually brings out the transphobes in force too, which is fun. The argument goes that if someone can simply identify as a man or woman because of how they feel, why can't someone identify as a particular race?
Yes, I have heard this several places. You libs, you say that gender and race are both social constructs. So if you can self-identify your gender based on how you feel because it's a social construct, why can't you do that with race?
Which, swing and a miss. It's really funny when people think they've caught you because they're repeating back to you something that they've heard you say. And of course, it doesn't matter that they have zero actual understanding of the situation. So anyways, this is obviously mind-numbingly bad, but it's something we're dealing with, so we should probably talk about it. So to try to put this argument to bed, we decided to bring on a black activist and a trans activist to discuss the situation and sort of just explain how ridiculous this entire line of thinking is. So with us this week are Alix, Jules, and Zinnia Jones. Alix's blog is on the Pathos Network and is called The Graffiti Wall. Welcome back, Alix.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And Zinnia Jones is a blogger on the Orbit Network. Her blog is called Gender Analysis. Welcome back, Zinnia.
Thank you for having me.
So, Alix, I think one of the things that's made pretty obvious by the discourse surrounding this case is that most people just plain don't even know what race is, let alone have any desire to discuss it honestly. So I'm curious, do you think Rachel Dolezal has actually done real harm to the conversation around race, or is she just a bigger manifestation of an already existing problem?
I actually think it's more of the latter, but definitely a bit of the first. When we start talking about cultural appropriation, and it is kind of a thing, it's not a global thing, but when we start dealing with various axis of oppression, especially in the United States, cultural appropriation has a very significant place here in the U.S. When you are demeaning and talking down or putting down the various characteristics and traits that you then decide that you're going to wear as a costume, there are some bad things that can absolutely happen. It's kind of like the hair thing with locks. Originally, when we started looking at black men and women who had locks and were being discriminated specifically because of the way we carried our hair. Now, of course, it's not 100% unique, but the preponderance of people that had locks once upon a time were black. It was part of something that we did. And then there was a lot of mimicking of some of these things that came out of culture, whether it was the 70s with cornrows and quote unquote French braids and twists, etc., even the Bantu knots. Originally, they were made fun of and stopped a lot of black people from being able to advance or even get into the workplace. And then all of a sudden, they become costume jewelry, something that people can wear. And yeah, that's where the idea of appropriation really comes into play. And then you have someone who, for some reason, and we still don't know exactly why, although we can kind of guess that it's because of the kind of advancement that she thinks that she's going to get, decides not just, it's not just going to be my hair, it's going to be my entire identity. One that she decides, again, to wear as a costume. And yeah, it begins to do a lot of harm to the conversations, especially when you start digging into when she begins to berate other black people about them not being black enough. That just becomes mind-numbingly just something that is just hard to even fathom. She didn't put this dress on until her 20s, after the entire Howard, the Howard University debacle. And so it was something that seemed to be much more convenient to her. But now you're dealing with people who have literally gone 20, 30, 40, 50 years trying to fight for many of these kinds of equalities that many of us are still fighting for today. And again, to see this person put this costume on and then be taken seriously, that does a lot of damage to the discourse.
Zinnia, you made a post on Facebook that I thought was pretty brilliant, and I'm just going to read it because I think it's awesome. I'm sick of Rachel Dolezal existing. Not only is there a matter of her comprehensive, ongoing, awful, unapologetic fuck-ups, which are more than terrible enough, but her entire bullshit stunt of a life seems to have offered so many clueless cis people a handhold to obliviously jump into making false trans parallels on the basis of their wholly uninformed intuitions. If someone can change their gender, then why can't they change their race? Wow, amazing. Hey, if blueberry Pop-Tarts can be frosted or unfrosted, then why can't we all fuck livestock? Food for thought.
I have wondered that same thing day in and day out. I hope that we will get the answer here today.
So, similar to what I asked Alix, do you think that she's also done harm to the conversation surrounding trans identities? Or, similarly, was it just like bad enough to begin with and people just didn't realize it until now?
I would say that it absolutely was bad enough to begin with, and she just was an opportunity for a pre-existing sort of tendency among many cis people to express itself. I mean, this is not necessarily a new thing, even in terms of transgender topics. You go back 10, 20 years, you will hear various politicians saying that homosexuality is wrong, or that marriage equality is wrong because what's next? A man marrying his box turtle? They treat these arguments like Mad Libs, where they can just fill in anything. And what that reveals is that many white, cisgender, heterosexual people have very little understanding of the basic phenomenology of transness or of race for that matter. They'll spout things like social construct, but they wouldn't be able to explain to you what that means in any sort of sociological sense or in any detail whatsoever, or what that actually means scientifically or in terms of research or anything like that. They can't really articulate that. They just heard it somewhere, and so they're going to repeat it because they think it's a convenient way to just hand wave something away.
Social construct is just a synonym for made up, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly how they treat it. That's exactly how they treat it. And one of the things I see here is that the case of Rachel Dolezal, it's not generalizable in that she individually is not some example of a larger phenomenon at all. This is a person whose life is extremely anomalous just in terms of her personality traits and the choices she's made and so on. This is not something that can be used as representative of any wider phenomenon. And I mean, we can just look at this. I may have a different experience, as a trans person compared to, most cis people who don't see this, but being around so many trans people over these years and seeing as just public awareness of transness has developed so much over the years, for better or worse, let's say. But what we see is that as basic awareness of what it is to be trans, that being trans is a thing, that this is a way of living your life, and so on. As basic awareness of that as a fact of some people's life spreads, people are increasingly able to recognize themselves in that. They hear this and they think, wait a minute, this helps me make sense of my life. And then they might pursue that, and then they might find, great satisfaction in that. They may find it to be something that helps them live comfortably for the first time in their lives. And then they are just able to go about their lives having recognized themselves in this, and often serving as an example for others to recognize themselves in as well. This is a well-known thing. It just perpetuates like that, and it's wonderful. And this, with Rachel Dolezal, you see nothing of the sort. You have her story coming out. You don't see a flood of people saying, oh my gosh, this is me. This explains something I've felt my whole life. Look how satisfied she is in her life now. Look how much better things are for her now. Wow, this could be me. I could go about my life like this, and I would finally find satisfaction. No, we don't see anything like this. Nobody is flocking after this. There is no surge, no groundswell of people who share these traits, these histories, these understandings of their lives at all. This is an individual anomaly that is not representative of any such thing. And the thing is, cis people, heterosexual people, white people, being on the outside of this, they have no understanding of that process of trans self-recognition in others, the benefits that come with transitioning, the improvement to our lives, and all of that. They just see, oh, if you can be this, blank, 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 why can't you be that, blank, blank, blank? And really what we see here is a person who does not seem to have found peace in her life at all. Trans people do want to just go about their lives as we are. This is a person who faked numerous hate crimes, took the positions of people of color, plagiarized the art of people of color, has been highly disruptive, unapologetic about it, and seemingly not very self-aware at all, or just does not even care. But this is a person with very distinctly different motives in this that do not seem to be reflected at all by some substantial portion of the population that shares in this.
And so let's just address the argument directly. Alix, can you talk about for a second the concept of being quote, transracial? Like, that word sounds dirty coming out of my mouth. I hate it.
Yeah, so do I. So do I. But I first have to say I'm never going to look at a blueberry Pop-Tart the same way ever.
Oh my God. Thanks for that, Zinnia.
Strawberry for Alix from now on.
Yeah, exactly. And when someone asks me to frost it, I'm just not going to be able to hold it together. There's no way. Yeah, the idea, and I hate the term as well, trans black. I still don't even understand what that word means. It's either you're black or you're not. Now, we can get into a lot of how did just the idea of being black come to be? It's been there. It's been there for centuries. We've been able to look at each other and say, hey, I can see the skin differences. And on the base of, biological terms, there are some unique traits that we can see between, the argument that always comes up is race. Again, race is a social construct. There's only, I'm going to say it and someone's going to clip it and cherry pick it. But there's only one race, right? We're all Homo sapiens, and everyone can be colorblind.
We're all from sub-Saharan Africa.
We're all
exactly.
Africans.
We are all Africans. Except that's not really true. I mean, where we're from, yeah, absolutely. But in terms of not just ethnicity and culture and treatment, all of these populations tend to be treated, very differently. Now, when I didn't know that I was black until I was told that I was black, and my experience being black is not entirely unique to just me, is me as a person, absolutely. But being a black person in America, even as an immigrant or a child of immigrants, you wind up dealing with a lot of the same pressures and stressors and things that really wind up shaping who you are and what your experience is. So this idea of being black, I mean, even with really light skinned children and people, and they still wind up getting classified as black. I have mixed children with blue eyes and slightly darker skin. No, they're dealing with the black experience, and they're growing up as black people because society is always going to see them as black. And so they're living this thing. So the idea of being able to put this on and it's kind of, it is very insulting. I mean, I want to look at this in a really good, positive way, and I can't, because people are saying, well, isn't it great that she wants to be black? And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I grew up in New York, and New York is very segregated for the most part. Places in Brooklyn, you'll go into some areas and you will not see, another someone that doesn't look like you, sometimes for miles. And I'm talking about even today, even with some of the gentrification that's happening, it's very, very black and white. But being able to look at each other and say, hey, yes, you're hanging out with me, you're dancing with me, you're growing up almost next to me, but as soon as you and I cross the tracks, I still continue to be black and you don't. Many of the privileges that you have no longer apply to me. They never applied to me, obviously. But, when we go into and deal with job interviews, and we both go into the same store, we leave Brooklyn, we go into the same store in Manhattan, and why is this person following me and not you? And dealing with the constant reality of that's very, very real. And so even my white friends who grew up and say, I had a very similar experience with you up until high school, et cetera. I never considered myself as black, although I shared somewhat in this group experience, this black cultural experience. I mean, I grew up with hip hop and graffiti, et cetera. And when we got stopped by the police, absolutely. I mean, there were white kids there with me. Of course, they were let go and they went home. And someone had to explain to my mom why I was being picked up for absolutely no reason. But they saw all of that. And it's not something that they wanted to imbue on themselves. I mean, who would purposely want to go through that, except for this one anomaly, obviously, by identifying in such a way. But it is something that has evolved. So even when we say race is a social construct, it is something that has evolved. It's not made up. It's not something that we can pretend and say, hey, it just is. No, there are many evolutionary reasons, as being social animals and creatures that we are, that that these constructs did evolve and they are representations of power, etc. So when someone says, I am trans black, I still don't understand what that means because, again, I can look at my white friends, and there were a few, look at white friends who experienced the same thing, but will never ever say that, yes, I am black, or yes, I actually lived the black experience. I grew up next to black people. I shared in many cultural experiences, and some of them were regional and hyper-regional, etc. Even if you grew up on my block, well, probably not my block, but not too far from my neighborhood, you could say, yes, we went to the same parties. We hung out. We danced with the same people. But they still don't claim being black. So this idea of trans black, could I walk into my office tomorrow and say, I'm white, I'm a black man with dreads. I'm going to walk in and say, there's nothing that I can do to become trans white.
I don't know. I think Michael Jackson kind of did that.
He was more, I was going to say translucent. No, he was more trans.
Oh God. Yeah. Well, I mean, cause I think of things like, one of the early episodes that we did was I had a dialogue with someone who posted on Facebook that trans people made him uncomfortable. And I decided to engage with him and ask him why. And we started talking, and he was a black guy, and he was talking about, some of the things that he's experienced as a black person, it being assumed that you're up to no good. People are always keeping an eye on you to make sure that you're not stealing something, like those kinds of things. And there are things in there that are sort of parallels to the trans experience. It's obviously not the same thing. And when we were able to connect on that level, it's like, well, on some level, you kind of know what this is like on a certain conceptual level, but it never would have even occurred to me to be like, well, gosh, you know what? We have so much in common. I must just be black. Like, it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. And Zinnia, I know when these comparisons are made, like, personally, I kind of feel insulted by it, because here's a woman who's pretending to be something she's not, taking up spaces that aren't for her, and now being trans is being compared to that. So, I mean, how does it make you feel as a trans person when those kinds of comparisons are made?
Well, it's very insulting, because here's a person who, as a white person, there was nothing to stop her from being an anti-racist ally and activist on that level alone, but she had to make this all about herself. Just to compare that to our experiences as trans people is completely inaccurate, because that's not what we see trans people doing at all. This is a person who is concealing something in order to live just a very disorderly life. And trans people they cease to conceal something about themselves. They live openly as themselves. Before trans people come out, that is when they're concealing something, and that state of concealment is generally not a healthy one for most of us. It is not something that we enjoy. We are trying to live authentically, whereas there is no indication that she is at all.
Alix or Zinnia, whoever wants to jump in and take this, how do we engage with this? What can we do or say to fight this kind of thing?
I would say that just increased familiarity with trans people as individuals and with our stories is important, so that people can see that this as a personal thing is a matter of our well-being and, as I said, our authenticity. That this isn't some matter of deception, that this isn't some matter of getting a tan and putting some bronzer on and faking hate crimes against the organization that you're leading and taking the place of an actual person of color. It's nothing like that at all. That this is something that genuinely improves our lives, that there are millions of us around the world, and that this is just one very difficult woman's messed up life, frankly, from everything that I've seen about her. And when you look at the actual substance of this, if you took out just those words, those swapping out of words for one another, you would see that in substance here, there are no parallels to be made whatsoever.
And Alix?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, but also add the idea that a lot of proponents for this argument like to throw out, which is choice. When we start looking at at what Rachel did specifically, she had the choice to do this. This is not something that she felt at birth. This is not something that at 5 years old she had a coming of age story and began to understand who she was. No, this is not, something that was triggered by puberty and she all of a sudden says, wait, this is not me. Again, this isn't her at the end of that adolescence realizing, you know what, maybe something doesn't no, this was a conscious choice that she made going into her 20s, again, after that lawsuit, after living as a white person, after embracing and engaging it, after taking those privileges and deciding that she was going to try and use that as a wedge, almost the reverse discrimination argument all over again, not understanding that, and then seeing, oh, there might be a real advantage of me being a black person. That immediately discredits the argument, in my opinion, because that's not the same choice.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Alix, Jules, Zinnia Jones, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for your insight. I learned a lot. It's that time once again to interrupt our show to ask you for your money. Bringing you the news each week simply takes a lot of time, effort, glitter, smart accessories, and, of course, money. This is something Heather knows very, very well. This week, Heather's contribution will be used to breed body doubles of school counselors who will infiltrate our schools and infect our precious children with the gay and the trans. Resistance is futile. If you'd like to help us continue the recruitment and indoctrination of the nation's children, head over to patreon.com/the Gaytheist Manifesto to find out more. Now here's an excerpt from my patrons-only audio journal for this week. I checked out the push-up bras in the catalogs I found in my grandma's basement. After I came out, I watched a bunch of tutorials on YouTube and got some advice from some friends, and I was ready. The bra I've worn for the past 6 months or so is actually sort of a Frankenstein. I took this old broken Torrid bra that I had and cut the cups out of it and attached them to the inside of another bra. I put it on and put a shirt over top and boom! It looked amazing! It didn't feel amazing. For this and more, including unedited interviews from today's episode, head over to patreon.com/the Gaytheist Manifesto and consider a donation to support the show. Thank you.
So in previous episodes, we have talked a bit about various trans tips and tricks that people use to reduce their dysphoria. And we've discussed a bit that for transmasculine people, one of the most important and coveted methods is chest binding, which is you put on a special piece of clothing or perhaps some tight sports bras or whatever you have on hand to flatten your chest and reduce the appearance of your breasts and make a more masculine type of contour.
And so there's a really cool study that came out recently. It was published in the Journal of Culture, Health, and Sexuality. And the study is actually the first of its kind to study the health effects of binding for transmasculine folks. And so obviously we feel like this is a really important conversation to have. So we invited some of the folks involved in the study to have a chat with us about it. So Sarah Peitzmeier, Jamie Weinand, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for inviting us.
So tell us a bit about the background of this study. What sorts of research topics you guys are looking into? How did this come about as something that you wanted to look into, and why did you think it was important to study this?
I can take that question first. So initially we started basically we were at an LGBT group for Boston University between the School of Public Health and the medical school. And someone raised their hand and said, hey, anyone interested in research with chest binding, please stay after the meeting. And that was one of the people in our group. Yeah, and I was like, wow, that sounds awesome. So it was four of us eventually came together. Two people, myself and another person who both identify as transmasculine. We had personally chest binded ourselves, and I was actually in the process of transitioning from FTM at that time. And then the other two people had actually dated folks who chest bound, if that's the right verb. And so we all kind of had like either a personal interest pretty much in it or like a wanting to advocate for the community. And so we just knew from personal experience that chest binding was, you know, both really important in terms of like mental health, but then obviously with physical health, there were some just concerns, and we were worried a little bit about like maybe a negative health impact from the physical side, but we knew that there was a positive impact. So we basically were trying to create a study that would sort of highlight both, because the last thing we wanted to do was to say, oh, look at this thing, it's so bad, it causes all these physical health problems. And we knew from personal experience that it was a really positive thing too. And we knew there was no research. You know, like I'm sure a lot of people, you know, you go onto Google and you research it and it kind of is this anecdotal evidence.
And that's because as far as the world's concerned, trans men or trans masculine people don't exist.
Right. Well, of course. And then Sarah actually came onto the study because as we kind of made a survey, and we'll get into that later, I'm sure. But then we realized like, oh shoot, we have no idea how to even begin analyzing what was a mega amount of data. And I knew Sarah through some people that I worked with at Fenway Health, and so I knew that Sarah was like a really solid, awesome LGBT research advocate / statistician.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, of course. So we like quickly got Sarah onto the project, and then she actually has kind of like spearheaded everything, so we wouldn't have even probably published without her.
Anything you want to add to that, Sarah?
The study really took off. Like 1,800 people responded to the study, which is a huge sample for transgender health research.
What is a typical sample size if you're doing a survey like that?
30.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, sometimes you see like trans health research is like, you know, a couple dozen, maybe a couple hundred.
So what kind of data did you collect? Was this all self-report survey, or did you take any kind of medical data? And what kind of, did you have any kind of inclusion criteria, like you have to identify as such and such and you have to wear a binder for this amount of time, or was it just anyone who had experience with binding?
So it was anyone who was assigned a female sex at birth or intersex identified, and then you just had to have bound at some point in your life. So it could be like current or past binding, and it could be for any length of time. Is that right, Jamie? I'm pretty sure that's what we did.
No, that's actually perfect. Sarah's right. That was our inclusion criteria, and then like the obvious things, like you had to be, you know, over 18 and stuff like that, because to get an IRB approved to work with people under 18 is really complicated, but of note, probably about 400 people who we couldn't use as respondents replied who were under 18. So that just actually goes to show that it's also like a pediatric issue, which is really important, right? Because that's the time of development for everyone, obviously, physically and emotionally. And then the other question you had about like, was it a medically identified like health impact or self-reported? You know, we obviously would have loved to have like a medical professional validate, you know, with that expertise to say, yes, this is like, I have this diagnosis, this like ICD-10 code, like the research that could have happened, that would have been incredible. But just from like our own limitations as like a self-funded, you know, independent student-led grassroots project, we ended up just using self-reported health impacts. That way everything could take place on a survey.
We also, like, I think, tried to... So we looked at 28 different outcomes, and we picked those outcomes based on reviewing the literature, what limited literature there was about potential negative symptoms, as well as just talking to folks who bind and asking what their health-related concerns were around binding. So a lot of the outcomes that we looked at, I think, don't necessarily need a medical diagnosis. I mean, you can say you self-report if you had pain in your shoulder or your chest.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, like if it made you feel weak or overheated or gave you acne, like you don't necessarily need to have a doctor like corroborate that.
You mentioned that you were looking at, I think you said 28 different outcomes that people experience from binding. So I'd like to get a summary of what the most common side effects are from binding and if they can be really severe. I know that personally I've experienced a few of the things that you listed, just like occasional like chest pain or shoulder tension or, you know, the binder digging into my side near my armpit. But I'm pretty small chested, so that stuff doesn't affect me a whole lot. But I have heard from a lot of people that it can be very painful for them.
So pain was actually probably some of our most common outcomes. So about half of the participants reported experiencing chest pain and half reported experiencing back pain. Shortness of breath was also about half of participants experienced that, and some like issues around skin itching and things like that. So those were some of the more common ones. The ones that were somewhat more severe, so 50 participants out of 1,800, or about 3%, reported that they actually had a rib fracture from binding. So there was really a range in terms of how common they were. Of course, the more severe ones tended to be less common, but actually severe pain was relatively common. We didn't report too much in the published paper on that, but I was taking a look, and about 40% of people in the sample reported, we asked them to rate their pain on a 10-point scale. So 40% of people said that they had a 7 or above in either neck pain, chest pain, back pain, shoulder pain, or rib pain. And then about 1 in 5 people said that binding limits their daily activities.
And was that something that, for example, people who were naturally had smaller breast sizes would probably experience less of that pain, and people with larger chests would experience more, or did you find it didn't really matter how large their breasts were?
So folks with a larger chest were really at higher risk of like the skin related issues. So they were at a larger chest size was associated with a higher likelihood of breast changes, breast tenderness, scarring, swelling, itch, skin changes, and skin infection. So it really, like, this pattern emerged that like skin related issues were associated with having a larger chest size. And then a lot of the other types of complaints around pain or neurological symptoms or gastrointestinal symptoms, those didn't tend to be closely associated with how large your chest was.
And I think that was surprising to us because we thought, kind of like what you had said, that maybe the chest size would play a role. And I think that's the cool part about this project, is that a lot of the stuff actually surprised us because it was kind of different than the anecdotal evidence we had seen online in community forums.
Yeah, that was something that I was really shocked by when I was reading over the study. There's this narrative in the transmasculine community that you should never, ever, ever bind with ace bandages or with tape because it's not breathable. Your chest can't expand, and it's going to lead to a lot of problems. And you could even like fracture your ribs or have really bad bruising if you do that. So you should always go with a commercial chest binder, like from Underworks or from some other company that makes these professionally. But your study actually found that some of those commercial binders might actually lead to more pain and more negative outcomes than, for example, the bandages. And I was really shocked and kind of worried by that because that goes against the conventional wisdom. Could you talk a little bit about how you discovered that, just more details about that, and why you think that might be the case?
We were really surprised about this finding as well. And in the paper, we try to kind of urge caution in interpreting these results. This is just the first study. Our results do say that, using ace bandages or duct tape is also strongly associated with a lot of these outcomes. So our data are consistent with the idea that, if possible, you should not be using duct tape or ace bandages. So I think one issue is that we didn't ask folks any details about how they used their binder. So, it's relatively common, we think, for people to size down their binder to, use a smaller size. Maybe that is, too much compression, and that is what is driving this association between binders and negative symptoms. Or, people double up on binders, and that could be, a lot of compression as well. So I think when we saw these results, we were saying, oh God, now we need to do another study and ask people details about, more specifics about their binding practices so we can get a better understanding of, kind of what's going on there.
And I think as a group, we kind of thought, well, a binder is made to compress. Right. So it almost kind of makes sense when I think about it retrospectively. Then I guess, maybe it would be associated with the most health impacts.
And there's also conventional wisdom in the transmasculine community, like the 8-hour rule or the 12-hour rule, that you should only wear your binder for 8 or 12 hours, depending on who you ask, and that you should take days off from binding. Is that something that the study found as well, that would be a healthy thing to do?
This was another really interesting and somewhat surprising finding we found. So we found that if you adjust for all of the different binding practices that someone has, the number of hours per day that they spend binding wasn't that associated with negative health outcomes. But what came out as being the number one most consistently associated binding practice was with negative health outcomes was the number of days per week that you do bind. So if you bound more days per week, you were at higher risk of nearly every outcome that we looked at. So that kind of emerged as like the number one predictor of negative health outcomes, days per week. So in our study, a little over 50% of people bound 7 days a week. So if you can dial that back and take 1 or 2 days off, we think, the data at least suggests that that might help limit your risk for a range of different negative health outcomes.
As a trans man myself, I had also heard kind of those anecdotal rules that you were talking about earlier, and I hadn't really heard to take the day off. So then when we found that as being one of the biggest predictors, that was super awesome to finally have something that says, hey, maybe this can help. And of course, obviously, a lot of people wouldn't feel comfortable taking the day off, and I understand that as well. But we also took this project to the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association. So it's basically like a group of LGBT providers and providers who are healthcare providers who advocate for the LGBT community. It's GLAMA. We presented our findings from this project there. And actually, those providers were also surprised. So they had actually also been telling people that it was more hours per day versus days per week. So it's kind of like, I think, challenges an assumption that we all make, whether we're in the community or outside of it.
Thank you both for coming on the show. Thanks for doing what you do. I think this is super helpful. This is super awesome stuff. Thank you both.
I love the chance to figure it out.
No problem.
Yes.
And a link to the study will be in the show notes. You can Google the Binding Health Project to find out more. And as always, please, 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 please stay safe and take care of yourselves. We're going to end the show this week with a bit of happiness. Let's face it, memes are a powerful method of communication. They're never good at communicating the nuances of an issue, but they do get a point across. There are even those who believe Donald Trump was actually memed into the presidency. With a renewed debate about transgender issues in the wake of wrestler and trans man Mack Beggs winning a state wrestling title in the girls division, all of the silly and awful anti-trans memes are making the rounds once again. One particular favorite of mine is a meme that compares the idea that someone can identify as whatever gender they want, then we must allow people to identify as any age they want too.
Shouldn't a 16-year-old who identifies as a 21-year-old be allowed to consume alcohol? Shouldn't a 40-year-old receive Social Security benefits and the senior citizen discount at the movie theater? I mean, if we're going to identify people simply because of their feelings, doesn't anything go?
A listener to the show named Colin reached out to me to ask my advice on how to respond to such silliness. And I gave it to him, and he used it in the most beautiful way. Here's his response. Let me try a couple different approaches to explaining the difference. First, I want to know, what do you do with intersex people? Exact stats are hard to find, but somewhere between 0.05 and 2% of humans are not simply male or female, but some variation on those themes. For reference, the percentage of redheads in the general population of Earth is about 2%. There are many different medical conditions that fall under this category, and most do not have the more common XX or XY sex-deterministic chromosome pairs. XXY is a common intersex example. Humans vary widely in hormone levels, genital configurations, and other sexual characteristics, so even something you might think is as clear-cut as male-female is nowhere near that simple or binary. Humans express a wide variety of genotypes and sexual phenotypes. Biological sex is a spectrum. Now let's move on to gender, which is a different category than sex. Sex refers largely to how your genetics, genitals, and other physical sexual characteristics are expressed. Gender is a more fluid concept that encompasses behavior and traits that society considers to be masculine or feminine. When we refer to gender roles in society, that's what we're generally referring to. Stereotypes like women are more nurturing and men are more decisive reinforce the dichotomy between the genders. There are certainly biological factors that influence these, testosterone being a huge factor in modifying both bodies and behavior. The point is, gender is complicated, it's fluid, and it depends on an interplay between culture, psychology, and physiology. What does it mean to act like a man or man up? Gender is a spectrum, and it's extremely hard to accurately assign a gender at birth before the child's brain is more fully developed. As a result, birth-assigned genders often do not match the true genders of the individuals, hence the existence of transgender people. Again, note the distinction between transgender and transsexual. Consider by analogy, inspired by the meme, the difference between age and maturity. Age is a measure of the physical passage of time since one's birth, but biologically it's a fairly arbitrary distinction. A premature birth can result in a huge difference between babies that are 6 months old as measured by the instant the cord was cut. Still, it's a fact that a certain amount of time has elapsed, leaving aside relativistic considerations for the moment, since the moment of birth. We use this number as a reference in society to set somewhat arbitrary thresholds for legal consideration. You're an adult at 18, you can drink at 21, you can drive at 15 or 16, collect Social Security at whatever the law says this year. One can't say, I'm not 18, I'm 21, and be factually correct if they were in fact born 18 years ago. However, people quite often say they feel older or younger than their biological age would suggest. A high school senior may be more mature than a college freshman, and a 70-year-old may act like a petulant toddler, despite the fact we legally assign them vastly different rights and responsibilities. Should an exceptionally smart and responsible 17-year-old be allowed to vote, and or a particularly irresponsible 22-year-old not be allowed to drink? Age is correlated with maturity, but certainly not perfectly. We draw lines based on age as a rough surrogate for intellectual and physical maturity to make legal limits easier to define and manage, not because someone magically becomes a more responsible person on the eve of their 18th birthday. If we interpret someone identifying as a 21-year-old to mean they feel mature enough to drink alcohol, that may in fact be true on a case-by-case basis, and that points to a limitation of our legal system to distinguish between maturity and age. To suggest that someone could identify as a different age is to misunderstand both age and identity. All of this, of course, is an oversimplification of the complexities of gender and sex, but to be fair, this is a Facebook thread, not a gender studies thesis. I hope this provides a starting point to help you understand the distinctions, though. Awesome. Before I go further, I want to answer a reasonable question. You might ask, there is brilliant analysis out there that's done by trans women themselves. Why are you sharing something from a cis person? Fantastic question. I share it as an example. We know that marginalized people have complicated relationships with allies. Sometimes allies speak over us, ignore us, and then pat themselves on the back for being good people. This is an example, in my opinion, of allyship done correctly. Colin reached out to me, being a trans person, to get my advice on how to respond. He expressed his desire to respond in a culturally competent way that would be effective in changing a person's thinking on the issue. He actively listened to the advice I gave and wrote a great response. The response does, of course, miss some nuance. It's not perfect, but I don't think that's a terrible thing. Sometimes we need to go very broad level overview and paint a more simplistic picture just to get people thinking and talking. If we truly want to change people's minds, sometimes we need to start on the level they're at instead of pulling out the gender studies textbooks. And I don't mean to say that in a dismissive way either. The complex and nuanced things need to be talked about. They're important. But I think it's okay to start from a more simplistic place and work up from there to change someone's mind. You can find Colin on Twitter at @LotOfTinyRobots. And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. Big thanks out this week to William, Teresa, and Tony for bringing these stories to our attention. If there's news happening where you are, or there's a story happening you think we should know about, shoot us an email at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. If you want to join our community and keep up to date on what we're doing, like us on facebook.com/thegaytheistmanifesto. You can follow me on Twitter at GaytheistCallie. You can follow the show at The Gaytheists.
Has this ever happened to you? Oh no, I was trying to do something and it went wrong. Is nothing easy? There has to be a better way. Now there is. It's Ari Stillman. They'll do some stuff to make it easier for you to do the thing that you were trying to do. For only no easy payments of nothing, you can friend Ari on Facebook or email aristillman4@gmail.com. Wow, thanks, announcer person. Now I can do the thing. Wink, thumbs up. Our representatives at the SJW Circle Jerk podcast are standing by. Insert pithy social justice joke. Dial 1-800 phone number and order now. We want to continue bringing you news and commentary at the intersection of the atheist and LGBTQ movement. If you appreciate the work and the activism we do, head over to patreon.com/thegaytheistmanifesto and consider a donation to support the show. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.